everyone. In tutorial 6, we started talking about research design, and I hope by now you can wrap your head around some of the details and decisions we have to consider when we are thinking about the design process. In this tutorial, I would like to talk more about specific research designs that I think you will come across in your reading and you might want to use in your own research. These are mostly those research designs that have a label or a name and a specific way of doing things in terms of designing projects. I will cover survey design, experimental designs, ethnographic design, case study design, and participatory action design in detail, and also summarize those designs in terms of the considerations we covered in the previous tutorial so that we can make it a bit more concrete and you can see how we apply those considerations in a design process. Then I'll also touch on evaluation research. This is more a research type, evaluation studies, as evaluation research can be done with a variety of research designs, but I thought it might be useful to you to have some more detail on evaluation research. And then at last, we will talk about some new design styles and ideas that are emerging in the social sciences, mostly from the pens of decolonial scholars and indigenous researchers and people taking Afrocentric approaches to research. And along these lines, we'll talk about cyclical and people-centered designs, about combative and disobedient thinking in terms of research design, and also relationality in research design. In everyday language, when we survey something, we examine it in terms of its general features and maybe its specific features and details. Now, as a research design, survey research is about collecting information on people's lifestyles, opinions, attitudes, motives, and demographic information. So just like in the simple definition, we use survey research to collect all kinds of general information, but also in some depth of detail. Survey research mostly collects information by asking people through, for instance, questionnaires and interviews, but it could also include other units of analysis. The design is popular because we can collect a large amount of data from a sizable population in a format that is standardized, easy to understand and interpret. In many instances, we use the word survey when we refer to a specific research method that involves questionnaires and statistical analysis. Now, this is totally fine to use it like that when you use the questionnaire survey as a specific method as part of another research design, maybe within a case study design where you use multiple methods and survey method is one of them. We can also call our entire research design a survey design. And then such a design can take many shapes and forms. For instance, we get a cross-sectional survey design. This is the simplest one. This is to create an overall picture of a phenomenon at a single point in time by collecting data only once. Then we get before and after survey design. Now, this could form part of a pre-test, post-test experimental design, but a before and after survey is created to look for changes over time regarding the phenomenon in question by measuring the situation or attitudes or perceptions or so on at two different times. So there's 2 points of data collection. Longitudinal survey design. Now, longitudinal surveys look at the long-term changes by collecting data on a continual basis. For example, trend studies that look back in time and look for changes about what happened in the past, or cohort studies that study the same population over a specific period of time but draw a different sample every time, or even panel studies that use the exact same sample of respondents and collect data from them over time. Survey research is often used in organizational contexts, like for business or government research, but is also found in research on other topics. Some of these applications include organizational surveys. These are surveys that are used to get a sense of the perceptions and opinions of staff about things that might impact their behavior or their performance or their satisfaction at work. We get opinion polls. Now, we usually associate opinion polls with politics, where polls are used to predict voting behavior. But opinion polls are also used to gather information on public opinion on many issues. Then we get attitudinal surveys. Now, attitudes are those feelings and beliefs and ways of thinking that affect human behavior. And an attitudinal survey can, for instance, give an organization insight into the attitudes of customers towards their service provision, for instance. Then we get community-based surveys or needs assessment surveys. These surveys are about getting data and understanding of certain issues or problems or experiences or needs that affect a specific community or target group of people. Often used in social development contexts, and we'll talk about this type of context again in evaluation research. Survey designs can include multiple specific research methods, mostly quantitative methods like questionnaire-based survey, where it is about determining incidence, frequency, distribution, and population characteristics, so that you can describe and compare and correlate and evaluate and so on. Within a survey design, it's also possible to include qualitative methods like in-depth interviewing and focus groups that can help the researcher get a better understanding and delve deeper into those attitudes, opinions, lifestyles, and so on that is determined quantitatively. We will talk more about surveys as a specific research method in the tutorial series to come. We will cover things like various types of surveys and various ways to implement survey research then. Now, in summary, let's look at the characteristics of survey design. Survey research is usually associated with post-positivist social research. It is compatible with other positions that are agnostic in terms of methodology, such as pragmatism, for instance, or potentially accepts a variety of research approaches and designs, such as critical realism. Survey research is empirical and yields primary data. Survey research could be used in exploratory work like a pilot survey, but are mostly about answering descriptive and causal questions. Usually quantitative in design, using descriptive and inferential statistics to analyze numerical data, even when yielded from interviews and/or observations, unless those methods are intentionally qualitative and meant as a supplement to the main questionnaire design. Specific research methods often include questionnaire-based surveys, but it can also include other types of surveys and methods such as structured interviewing. Survey research could be compatible with many theoretical traditions, but are founded on more the ideas of behaviorism that we can associate with the socio-psychological tradition of communication theory. Survey research is usually theory-driven, often designed deductively for the testing of hypotheses from theory, but could also be inductive in the case of a pilot study or an exploratory survey study. Survey research can be done cross-sectionally, longitudinally, and before and after. Next up is ethnographic research design. Now, ethnographic research comes from the field of anthropology, where researchers immerse themselves into the day-to-day lives of communities to study their practices, behavior, actions, and contexts of that specific group of people. Now, there's a lot of criticism against this older style of ethnography, where, like a foreign researcher, lurks in the presence of a community in order to extract information about their lives. However, today there are many instances of ethnographic designs that are relevant and exciting for communication researchers and are much more respectful versions of ethnographic research that can work very well for getting an insider's perspective about what people experience and do in their real life contexts of work or social or whatever context. Conventional ethnographic designs are for studies that want to get an in-depth cultural understanding of a group of people and how they describe and structure their lives. Typically a community, but that community can take many forms. Community can also mean a group of people that live together, or a family, or could be the staff of an organization, or an online community like a Facebook group. Besides the more naturalistic and interpretative traditional ethnography, there's also a type of ethnographic design that we call critical ethnography that is more informed by critical theory and geared towards issues of oppression and emancipation. Ethnographic designs usually use multiple specific methods, often called collectively field work or field research, and include specific methods like participant observation, content analysis, and interviewing, usually done in phases over an extended time. We will look at these methods in more detail in the tutorial series on methods, but in studies with ethnographic research designs, some methodological considerations are relevant for the study on the whole. These include the role of the researcher and the bounding of the study. In ethnographic research, each separate research method might have its own measuring instrument, like interview schedules or questionnaires or whatever, but on the whole, the researcher themselves are the primary data collection instrument of the fieldwork, as their personal involvement and decisions and interpretations made throughout are key to this design. It's important for the researcher to therefore declare their biases, their values, assumptions, and so on from the onset of the study, and to keep those biases and values and things in mind throughout the study. This clarification of researcher bias is part of the verification process in ethnographic studies, and other verification practices like member checking is also involved, where you check with others or participants in the study. You check in with those people in throughout the research, so that that you can check your interpretations and understandings of the data that is collected. Then the bounding of the study. It's also a practice in ethnographic research to demarcate the study in terms of the setting. So who are the actors, the events, and the processes that will be studied? Before the specific methods of collecting data can be contemplated, this demarcation must be done so that the researcher can ensure that their methods can cover all the bases they need covered. But bounding off the study also reveals the priorities and the focus areas of the research. While it's entirely possible to see an organization as a community group and conduct an ethnographic study about almost any aspect, and it's especially great for studies on organizational culture, for instance, two types of ethnographic design are particularly relevant, I think, for organizational communication, and that is institutional ethnography and virtual ethnography. And then there's one other interesting one that you might want to note. It's called autoethnography. Institutional ethnographic studies are, like all ethnographic studies, a bottoms-up way of doing research. In this case, starting at the micro level of everyday personal experiences of individuals in organizational settings. However, institutional ethnography is different from general ethnography, in the sense that general ethnography is focused on those human experiences of everyday life, whereas institutional ethnography uses people's experiences of everyday life only as a starting point for understanding social relations in the bigger setting. So institutional ethnographic designs start with individual experiences, but then works itself up to uncover like institutional discourses and institutional practices that perpetuate certain power and other social relations that are both institutional and societal, and it's those type of discourses and practices that would be skipped over if a study started with the organization as the unit of analysis. It's about how the micro level individual experiences are interconnected with the macro level of organizational life. As conceptualized by Dorothy Smith, institutional ethnographic research designs are more aligned to critical ethnography and are mostly suitable for studies that are on topics of institutional power relations or other versions of social oppression in organizational settings that we associate with maybe the transformative, critical realist, and decolonial philosophical orientations. Then virtual ethnography. This is basically about using ethnographic design and techniques in online spaces. Instead of conducting the research in a real natural setting, the natural environment is an online environment, like a Facebook group or an online game or the metaverse. And data collection happens in that environment. For organizational communication research, such virtual settings could include a staff WhatsApp group or an online forum for staff members. Or when it comes to marketing communication, it could be a group of Twitter followers that comment and interact with each other in an organization and the organization about their products and services or the company itself. There are increasingly many options for this. So many of us are interacting in the metaverse. We shop online, we meet online, we get education online, we work remotely. So more and more of life is going online. When an ethnographic study is designed for a virtual setting and a virtual community of people, the entire design and the bounding of that study must be adopted to fit this environment. Specific methods might need to include discourse analysis or artifact analysis rather than content analysis, because many things happen like in a mix of written, visual, multimedia formats, and is not straightforward content always. Interviewing should maybe be adapted to rather be a back and forth private messaging conversation, for instance. There are many ethical considerations in terms of privacy and stuff in the online space, like when is something private and when does it happen on a public space? How does consent and member checking and so on work? So if you do take on such a design, make sure you are on top of the ethical stuff as well. Then there's autoethnography. Autoethnography is a mix of ethnographical and autobiographical. So not only is the researcher involved or part of the research as we have in other ethnographic designs, but the researcher becomes the object of the study, in that the research is about the cultural connections between the researcher and a specific social context. Autoethnographic studies then are about the relationships, experiences, and interactions of the researcher as observed by the researcher themselves. And the research process includes things like a critical self-reflection and self-examination on the part of the researcher. What makes this ethnographic design interesting is that it might be valuable in organizational communication studies that want to throw away the idea that the researchers should remain uninvolved to some extent and where possible. This also seems compatible with the ideas of centeredness and relationality we see in decolonial philosophy, and it might be a great way to study organizational communication topics from these positions. In summary, let's look at the characteristics of ethnographic research. Ethnographic research is traditionally associated with interpretivism, but there are more critical interpretations of this kind of research, sometimes called critical ethnography, and in that interpretation, ethnographic designs are then also compatible with the transformative, critical realist, and decol research philosophies. Ethnographic research is empirical and based on primary data. Ethnographic research is mostly exploratory and descriptive, but can also be critical. This design is outright qualitative. The data is collected via fieldwork that can include specific methods such as participant observation, other types of observation, interviewing, and document analysis, or in the case of virtual ethnography, like all kinds of social artifacts or discourse analysis too. Ethnographic research is usually associated with the humanist and cultural theoretical traditions, but critical ethnography is explicitly linked to the critical tradition of theory. Ethnographic research is inductive and usually have no to little guidance from ideas based on theory. And some ethnographic work would specifically also aim to contribute or to build theory. Ethnographic studies are ideally conducted over a long period of time and is very time-consuming in itself, but it might contain aspects that are cross-sectional or more specific in terms of time dimension, but it is usually a longitudinal study on the whole. Some people would say that case studies are a type of ethnographic design. But for organizational communication research, case studies have a wide appeal because organizations are easily defined as entities and can easily be seen as single units of analysis that make case study research ideal. But the research then doesn't necessarily correspond with what we would term ethnographic research. So you can see a case study as an ethnographic design, specifically if your research is designed in such a way that ethnography is an ideal label for your study, but you don't have to. And you can then call your design a case study design without mentioning ethnography. We often call case study designs single system designs because a case study is usually about focused on one individual, one program, one event, one organization, or one publication, or whatever, for the purposes of getting an in-depth understanding of a specific phenomenon in that single context. But it can also be about more than a single unit and include a small number of units, like maybe 3 units. In most organizational communication studies, a case would be a single organization or a small number of organizations, but it could also be that the focus or the unit is a specific department within an organization that form the case study. Or it could be other units, such as a communications campaign, like a specific marketing campaign, or even a specific organizational event, like a year-end function or a golf day. Or it could be a corporate publication, like a year-end report. The case study can even be about a specific period of time, too. Case studies are usually flexible and suited for exploratory work, and a researcher using such a design cannot generalize their results. But the value of the design is more in the intensive investigation that can be done into one or a few cases. Case study designs are usually expected to include a number of specific research methods that could include both qualitative and quantitative methods, but the overall design is usually more qualitative in nature. Case study research can take a number of specific strategies. Let's look at some of those. That you can have a single case study versus a multiple case study strategy. Many case studies choose a single unit or case. This can be because that case is critical or unique or extreme in terms of the phenomenon that you are studying, or it can be because you are studying something that is relatively unknown, or it could be because of access and feasibility type reasons, like you are working at a specific organization. A case study strategy can also use to incorporate more than one case. This is the multiple case strategy. The rationale here can be to establish whether the same findings can be derived at multiple cases, making it more transferable and dependable on the whole. Then we get a holistic case versus an embedded case strategy. If you choose an organization and on the whole and treat that organization as the case, it is a holistic case study strategy with only one unit of analysis. But if your research also requires you to select different subunits of that one organization, maybe like the different functions or different departments, those subunits will each become like a little case that is embedded in the bigger case. And your study will have 2 different units of analysis, the organization on the whole and the different departments as separate units. Now, in summary, let's look at the characteristics of case study design. Case study research is traditionally associated with interpretivism, especially if you see it as part of ethnographic research. But depending on the project, case study design is potentially compatible with various philosophical positions. Case study research is empirical and could be based on both primary and secondary data. And case study research is mostly exploratory or explanatory, but can also be descriptive or answer other types of research questions depending on the purpose of the research. The design is generally qualitative, especially if you see it as a form of ethnography, but it could be described as a mixed or multi-method study in some instances. Triangulation of methods and sources of data are conventionally expected, so that multiple methods are usually used to corroborate each other. These methods could include both quantitative and qualitative methods like observation, interviewing, document analysis, secondary data analysis, and questionnaire-based surveys. Ethnographic case study design is mostly associated with the humanist and cultural theoretical traditions, but depending on the nature of the specific study, it could be aligned to other theoretical traditions as well. Ethnographic case studies usually have no guiding ideas about theory, but would rather aim to contribute to theory. Other forms of case study work might be more theory-driven. Data collection for case study research is intensive and time-consuming. This is because multiple methods are used and building relationships and trust between the researcher and others that are participating in the research is usually necessary, so the process could be a little bit elongated. However, we usually do not describe a case study as either longitudinal or cross-sectional. In very simple terms, experiments are about doing something and seeing what happens. In our everyday lives, we get to understand many new things through experimenting. For instance, you eat a new food to see whether you like it or not. Or you learn how to drive through lots of small trial and error type experiments. You step on a pedal, you turn a steering wheel, you shift a gear, and before you know it, you have learned how to drive. We also don't use experimentation only for new things. We also use it to refine something. For instance, you can refine your signature dish by doing experiments with more or less tomatoes, more or less cream, more or less sugar, for instance. In the scientific world, experiments is a form of research that we get from the natural sciences. But in social and business research, most experimental research is about people and their behaviors. Basically, an experiment is about creating a research setting that is under the control of the researcher to some extent, where specific things can be tested with a specific group of people. Now, simply, you have to create two groups of people normally. The one group is exposed to some form of intervention or change or manipulation, while the other group is not exposed to that manipulation or change or intervention. And then the two groups are compared. Here's an example. If you want to find out whether knowing the core values of a company changes customers' opinion of that company, you will measure the opinion of two groups of people about that company. Then you will put one of the groups in a room where you show them a video explaining the core values of the company. After this exposure, you will test their opinions again about the company, and then you will compare the two groups. You compare it to a test done on the group not exposed, and then the comparison will tell you whether being exposed to the values of a company makes a difference in people's opinions. Conventionally, a classic experiment has the following features. There are dependent and independent variables. Experiments is about testing links between variables. For us, variables are things like characteristics, parts, dimensions, for instance, of social phenomena. Like in our example, the two variables are customer opinions, and knowledge of company values. The independent variable is the variable that changes and affects the dependent variable. So here, knowledge of company values is the independent variable, and customer opinion is the dependent variable. Experimental research is about manipulating the independent variable, in this case the knowledge of core values, and measuring the dependent variable, customer opinion, before and or after the manipulation of the independent variable. Implied here is that for experimental research to work, the variables must be known, must be well defined, and must be limited in number. Then you also get experimental and control groups. That's the two groups we spoke about earlier. Classical experiments make use of these two groups of people so that they can be compared. The group that is exposed to the stimulus or the change or the manipulation is the experimental group, and the group that is not is the control group. It is usually important that the population from which the sampled groups come are known, and that the groups are put together in a way that they are similar to each other. This way, the only difference between them is that exposure to the manipulated variable. In the third place, you have the controlled research environment. Experiments are all about controlling the environment. This is done to ensure that no other external variables influence the study. If there is the possibility of other factors shaping the opinion of the two groups about the company, the results of the research will not be entirely valid. For example, if members of the research groups are accidentally exposed to marketing materials of the company, it can no longer be said that this video on company values is the only possible difference between the two groups. It is also important to control the research environment to ensure that the conditions of both groups are the same. Even small things like temperature differences, different food for lunch, and so on could potentially have an impact on the stability of the measurement. Then there's lastly pre-testing and post-testing. Conventionally, experimental research measured the dependent variable, so customer opinion, before the exposure to the independent variable and then again afterwards. This way, the difference between the two measurements can be attributed to the independent variable. So far, we've been talking about the basic version of classic experiments. There are many more complicated experimental designs where more groups of people and more variables are at play. But if you understand these basics, you are already well on your way. What is more important is to talk about experimental design that is not, strictly speaking, adhering to all the criteria for a classical experiment. In practice, many researchers use variations of experimental design that we can call quasi-experimental, because doing research in controlled environments is often not possible, and because research designs are created and adapted to suit the specific purpose of the research, these variations of experimental and quasi-experimental designs are often used. Experiments can happen in more natural settings, and they are usually called field experiments. Field experiments are similar in design to classical experiments, but the research doesn't happen by putting people in a room, for instance, but in their natural environments. For example, you can give a discount voucher at the door of Woolworths to every second customer that walks through the door, and then compare their purchasing behavior between those that got a voucher and those that didn't get a voucher by maybe comparing their till slips or the contents of their baskets or whatever. But because the environment is not under the control of the researcher, and people's behaviors can be influenced by many other things in that setting, like other promotions going on or marketing materials or the price discounts or whatever that person needs on that specific day, you might not be able to say the voucher made a specific difference between people's purchasing behavior, but you might get some insight about whether vouchers are worthwhile as promotional tools. Sometimes the experiment happens naturally, maybe like the COVID pandemic. Different types of organizations were affected differently, like tech-driven companies could keep working while companies that need people on factory floors couldn't. And if we want to study how different types of organizations change in terms of their communication, we can interview people from different types of organizations and compare them to each other. But we didn't do the experiment. The experiment happened by itself. Other type of experimental design is using a looser version of what is seen as an experimental group and a control group. Maybe you want to study the effect of working remotely due to COVID, what effect that has on the attitudes of staff members. You can select one group of staff from an organization where people are working remotely due to COVID as an experimental group, and select another group of staff from a company where people are not working remotely as your control group. This way you can do some kind of comparison between the groups, but because you have less control over who those people are and the differences between the companies in other ways, the comparison is not entirely as valid as would be in a classical experiment case. Some experimental research in social sciences are longitudinal, like tracking the relationships between variables over time. These are called time series designs, and they involve taking measurements over a time before and after an intervention, so that patterns and trends are also taken into account. For this type of quasi-experimental design, we also see the use of multiple data sets that were collected over time. So this is called a multiple time series design, and we can understand it as a longitudinal version of a non-equivalent control group design. Now, in summary, let's look at the characteristics of experimental research design. Experimental research is consistent with ontological and epistemological realism, making it mostly compatible with positivism, post-positivism, critical realism, and potentially pragmatism. Experimental research is most often empirical research using primary data. Experimental research is suited for answering causal and explanatory questions, but also exploratory and descriptive questions in some instances. Experimental work is usually quantitative research using mostly statistical analysis and mathematical techniques of analysis. Specific research methods are most often structured observations, questionnaire surveys, and interviews. Experimental research is mostly associated with behaviorism and therefore the socio-psychological tradition of communication theory. Experimental research is usually strongly theory-driven, often designed for hypothesis testing or testing of theoretical models via the deductive style of reasoning. Experimental research could be done cross-sectionally, but longitudinally and with time frames in between those categories too. Participatory action research, in short PAR, designs put the researcher in the service of those being studied. They participate in the problem and needs identification, in the design of the research, and the research is intended to help solve their problems and promote their interests. Action research is about actually doing something in the real world, usually to solve a localized problem in a specific setting. Action research is not about aloof, ivory tower reflection and research, but getting your hands dirty in the world of politics, development, and intervention. Research is not separate from any other forms of knowledge, and researchers are not separated from the real world. Action research is therefore designed to be flexible so that changes can be made as possible solutions are applied in real life. It is a process where research findings are applied immediately in the form of an intervention to see whether they are successful in improvement or creating change. Action research mainly relies on observational and behavioral data, and it's never about generalizing results, but about making a difference to a specific problem in a specific context. As you can see from this broad scope of what can be PAR, such designs could include a number of methods and usually relies on using multiple methods. Methods can include in-depth interviews, focus groups, observations, questionnaire-based surveys, and so on, depending on what the specific action or intervention or situation is about. In summary, let's look at the characteristics of PAR. PAR is usually part of transformative or critical philosophical positions and are also potentially useful to decol scholars. PAR is empirical and based on primary data. PAR is action-focused. So they are focused on questions of change and transformation, but are also exploratory and descriptive in a more formal sense. PAR is generally qualitative, and methods such as participatory observations, interviewing, document analysis, and storytelling can be used, but sometimes mixed methods is also appropriate. PAR designs are strongly linked to the critical theoretical tradition. PAR is mostly inductive as the focus is on participation and not on guidance from theory. PAR is known as an iterative process of problem identification, planning, taking action, and evaluating. So while it is time-consuming, it is usually not described in terms of a time dimension like cross-sectional or longitudinal. As social scientists concern themselves with social issues, there is a lot of research done around social needs and problems in society. One stream of field of study, just like PAR, is evaluation research. Evaluation research is research that evaluates some aspects of social intervention, such as development programs, educational interventions, and behavior change campaigns. Evaluation research includes research designed to assess the needs or problems addressed by a social program, appraise the implementation and administration of programs, measure the outcomes and efficiency of programs, or make determinations about the impact of these programs. This type of research is very much an example of applied research in that way that it's not strictly a research design by itself. As evaluation research can draw on many other types of designs, and many of the design decisions depend on the specific nature of the program, the context, and the specific focus of the research. Design strategies can include experimental and qualitative research designs. Then there are the new emerging ideas we are seeing in social science research. And I want to share three of these type of developments and design styles or design developments with you. The first is cyclical and people-inspired design. Research that is done from a decolonial indigenous intent often uses indigenous and metaphorical processes as concepts to inform their research design. It is the sense of human communality, integration, and sharing that is found in processes and metaphors that are important to a certain group of people that make for a culturally relevant research design's basics. Decolonial, post-colonial, indigenous type researchers often break away deliberately from linear research design and opt for seeing research in a more cyclical fashion. The same as PAR, that we call iterative, based on a worldview that recognizes the interconnections and interdependence of all things, such as cyclical or circular research design shows interconnections between the dead, the living, the yet to be born, the natural, the human, and it brings dreams, visions, intuitions, historical and present day knowledges, and so on into the research process, usually in a symbolic way, but sometimes also in a practical sense. Such a design centers on tools and processes that are already recognized and integrates the values and customs of people, allowing for the research to be iterative, with those participating determining the process, the priorities, and the knowledges. The example on the screen is of a medicine wheel research design that is inspired by the Cherokee people. And that shows the interconnection that integrates the research process with existing and established processes and customs in that cultural group. Using cultural principles, ethical frameworks and metaphors that are intrinsic to, in our case, South Africans, to inform a research design is another way used in decolonial and indigenous projects. Three of these philosophical psychologies intrinsic to a number of African cultures is Ma'at and Nomu, and then the very well-known Ubuntu. In short, Ma'at refers to the quest for justice and truth and harmony. So interrogating the manner in which the research process is in harmony with the culture of the people and pursues issues of truth and justice. Then there's Nomo, that describes knowledge creation as a vehicle for improvement of human life and human relations. And then Ubuntu is an ethical framework, principles of religiosity, respect for the self and through others, consensus, harmony, and respect for specifically context, specificity, and historicity. In line with decolonizing our minds, these virtue ethical type frameworks are mixed with how reality is viewed, how knowledge is viewed, how our everyday behavior should be, and also how we should be when we are doing research. There is no separation between who we are as people, as Africans, as historically and culturally situated humans, as part of something much bigger than us. We are the same when we do research. So we use the same principles when we design research. Next is what I termed here combative or disobedient designs. Now this is the name I put to it. So I suggest please don't use such a type of label without reading and thinking about it for yourself. And also, such designs will probably not be called a research design at all, because the researcher is actively trying to get away from Western ways of framing and organizing and labeling and naming. So you'll maybe not even, if you are feeling like you should put your research together in a way that is combative or disobedient, you will probably not even call it a research design. In doing this, decolonial scholars disrupt and question, displace, rattle, unsettle, and so on, what is seen as oppressive and alien research methodology, and thereby making space for more liberatory African contextual type of approaches to emerge. The decolonial research tradition can be seen as an application, therefore, of what is in a philosophical sense called epistemic disobedience. Epistemic disobedience is like an intentional delinking from what is regarded as rational and modern and Western. When a research design is presented by a decolonial research that is created from alternative knowledges, it is immediately, in a way, already combative and disobedient, as it confronts the epistemicide that is permitted and perpetuated by Western methodologies. Researchers that take such a position on research design often come up with their own contextual research methods, such as using Imbadu or decolonial critical analysis or things that are labeled in a specific and unique way. Then, Bagele Chalisa says that indigenous research should make use of social networks and human relationships in the design of research studies. Such a design then puts emphasis on moving the focus from the individual to the collective, to multiple connections even, like interconnections or interdependencies. She gives us one example of such a research design from the Maori people. It is called the Creative Relationship Framework or Design. Maybe it's not really translatable to Africa, but I want you to see how cool this is and open your minds maybe to conceptualizing things like this for our own context. It is a creative relationship framework, and the research goes like this. The research process starts with a literature review where a variety of sources are consulted to get implicit and explicit understanding of an indigenous view on the research topic. It is not a literature review as we use it in other words, not an academic literature review only, but a centering of indigenous understandings and conceptualizations. Then there is the consultation process, something like seminars or community meetings where the researcher meet with skilled or wise people from the community to consult about the correct way of doing things. They are like elders or mentors that are gifted with special insights and leadership, and they are looked up to by others for their advice and their wisdom. This consultation process is like the research method here, maybe. Then there is also a step in the design that comes down to intentionally and reflexively, where all of those that are participating reflect on their own positionality, context, and relation to everything else. Now, as always, there's a lot more to be said about research design and many more possible ways to design research than the ones we covered today. But I really hope that just having more information on some of the popular research designs, you can use those ideas and search on your own for research design considerations when you are doing your own research design. All right, until we speak again, goodbye.